Good afternoon. I'm Stephen Molino from Molino Stewart, and I've been looking at flood evacuation for the last 20 years and in more recent years using agent-based modelling to investigate evacuation from large floodplains with large numbers of vehicles. On this particular project, I was assisted by Kelsey Sanborn, who's a spatial and natural hazards analyst at Molino Stewart. We were doing the work for Liverpool City Council, and Maruf Hussain, Rashan Khadka and Raj Atur were significant contributors to the project. What we were looking at was the Georges River in Sydney and basically seeing if we put more development in there, whether it's possible for those people to get out. We're going to look at some of the flood challenges on the Georges River. What were the drivers for investigating flood evacuation there? Then Kelsey will talk us through the model setup, and then we'll discuss the results and some of the impacts and the next steps. The Georges River is in southwestern Sydney. So here's the Sydney CBD over here, Botany Bay here, and the Georges River comes from the south down near Campbelltown, heads up into the Liverpool area, then hooks a huge 180-degree turn, heads south and then east out to Botany Bay. And so this is a blow up of where it does that hook through Liverpool. So Liverpool CBD is here. This area is known as Chipping Norton and Moorebank, so it forms a bit of a peninsula in between the two reaches of the Georges River. And there are quite large floodplains in this area, and as you can see, quite a bit of urban development and commercial and industrial development in these areas. It also has some major tributaries, Cabramatta Creek being the largest tributary of Cabramatta Creek is Brickmakers Creek. We also have Anzac Creek coming in here as well as some other minor tributaries, and they become important when we're looking at the flood evacuation. Historically, it's had a number of large floods, particularly in the late 1800s. There were at least 4 floods that were around the 1% AEP in 1860, 1873, 1887 and 1889. The Liverpool collaboration area is an area that's been identified as part of the Greater Sydney Regional Plan as a growth area. There's a proposal to have at least 20,000 new dwellings and more than 15,000 new jobs in this area. This is the Liverpool CBD here, and the idea is to increase the amount of jobs and population in this whole area around Liverpool. Currently, there's already planning proposals before Council and the Department of Planning with up to more than 30,000 new dwellings in those planning proposals. But flooding has been identified in this area as a potential constraint to growth, and we were asked to have a look at how that might constrain future development. I'm going to hand over now to Kelsey, who'll talk through how we set the model up to look at that.
All right, so yeah, I'm just going to go through a brief overview of the model setup and mostly just concentrating on what the primary inputs were. So basically, what did we put in to get our interesting evacuation results from the model? So the model itself is called LSM, or the Life Safety Model, which is an agent-based dynamic warning response evacuation and fate model. And in order to get the model results, one of the key inputs is the 2D flood models themselves. So as Stephen mentioned, our focus was on Georges River, but we did also include 2D flood models from the neighboring tributaries as well, where the data was available, in order to get a more holistic idea of the area. And the model itself, it is moving vehicles from houses onto the roads, or houses or buildings onto the roads and towards an evacuation destination. So an important component of that is a file of the existing development, so showing where the buildings are, and from that, what number of existing vehicles will be leaving from the buildings. So looking at both residential and non-residential vehicles. And this was an area that we had to spend a bit of work in order to come up with an appropriate methodology, because there can obviously be several different ways to calculate the number of potentially evacuating vehicles that would be on the roads in the Georges River probable maximum flood. So we developed a methodology to estimate residential vehicles using the flood model data as well as the 2016 census data as our base case current day scenario, as well as cadastre data, aerial imagery, and a bit of ground truthing using Google Street View. The non-residential vehicles were a bit trickier to calculate because there's obviously lots of different components that go into understanding how many non-residents may be in the floodplain at any given time. But we developed a methodology in consultation with the SES and Infrastructure New South Wales, which is based on journey to work data published by Transport for New South Wales, which gives us a good approximation of the number of people that may be working within the floodplain but don't necessarily live there. Then on top of this, we've looked at the road network, which includes a number of lanes of traffic, which is important in order to know how many lanes of evacuating traffic might be leaving. And then based on this, as I'll show in subsequent slides, we've created evacuation subsectors and defined evacuation triggers. So from here, just to give you an idea of what the model outputs or the inputs look like, the PMF extents from the Georges River as well as in neighboring tributaries were used in order to define the study area and also undertake an emergency response classification of communities. So an important component of this was to get an idea of how different areas will be able to leave the floodplain and what time they have to leave in order to get out safely. So in order to do this, we had to go through and identify the flood islands within the study area, as well as areas that have rising road access or potential overland escape routes. And we did so using the time series outputs from the Georges River PMF. And based off of this information, we defined subsectors. So we found 43 evacuation subsectors in the study area, which is underneath the PMF of the Georges River and neighboring creeks. And we defined subsectors by finding areas that would have to take shared evacuation routes and also have shared flood risks. So they will have to respond to the same specific trigger levels. So each subsector was given was assigned trigger levels which defined when they will have to leave and when the vehicles within that subsector will leave the respective buildings and head on to the evacuation routes. And then finally, an important component of this was not only defining the road network itself as well as the number of lanes, but also knowing which roads will actually be able to be used in an evacuation. So we went ahead and cut roads at locations where they might be flooded in a 1 in 500 AEP or more frequent event by the river itself or the local creeks. So we made an assumption that if the Georges River is flooding, there likely also be some level of flooding in neighboring creeks and tributaries, and so we don't want to send people down an evacuation route that might potentially be flooded. So we put in these strategic road cut locations where the potential evacuation routes would be cut off so that the vehicles would have to find an alternate route.
The basis for our modelling was the New South Wales SES life safety model, timeline evacuation model, which has been presented at the conference a number of times by the SES and others. But it basically works on the assumption that there are evacuation operations once an evacuation is called, in which there will be some time delay as people receive the warning, accept it, and understand it applies to them, get ready to evacuate, and then start travelling out along the evacuation route. And if that travel time for getting everyone out past the point that they need to get past exceeds the time the warning time that's available, then we have a time deficit and we have a safety issue. But if they can get out in time and also allowing for a traffic safety factor to account for the possibility of car accidents or breakdowns or other contingencies, and there's a surplus time, then we know that we do have sufficient road capacity within that warning time to get people out safely if they choose to leave. So when we set up the life safety model, you can see the dark purple areas are people that haven't yet received a warning. Then it becomes light purple when they have received the warning. And then afterwards, they start travelling out along the roads. And the yellow is them travelling out along the roads. The fate of those who fail to evacuate before the flooding catches up to them is one of the other things that the life safety model will do. And you can see that the up in this area here, we have quite a few people that have not yet been able to get out. They've left their buildings, but they are stuck in a traffic queue. When we have a look at the flooding and the way the flooding evolves, you can see that up in this Chipping Norton area, there's some flood islands, which are low flood islands, and they go under. So it's very important that those people are able to get out before their evacuation routes are cut and they are overwhelmed by floodwaters. There's areas over here in Warwick Farm, which are also low flood islands. And some of these places get isolated in events as frequent as the 5% AEP, the 1 in 20 chance per year of flood. One of the things that we found too when we were looking at this, when we took into account that creek flooding, here's Brickmakers Creek and Cabramatta Creek, could very well cut these various available evacuation routes, we found that this non-residential area and this residential area don't actually have an evacuation route on public roads that is free from the risk of flooding by local creeks. However, we did find that there is a private access route through this light industrial area here, which if it were able to be utilised, would provide an escape route onto public roads that run along a ridgetop. So that was one of the things that we weren't expecting to find, but that the analysis revealed to us. Another key finding was that the SES's strategy of evacuating everyone out on the M7, heading them north here, creates something of a bottleneck. There's only 2 lanes heading up here on the M7, yet the 2 feeder roads, the M5 and the Hume Highway, both have 3 lanes. So we have 6 lanes going into 2, and that causes queuing back on the Hume Highway and the M5. So far back on the M5, that Nuwarra Road, which feeds onto the M5, is also queued, and the queuing is then going back into these areas here. And as we showed earlier, we've got low flood islands up in this area. So one of the key concerns is being able to get all of these people out before these floodwaters rise and cut off their routes and then overwhelm them. As a result of this first stage of our investigations, the New South Wales SES is now reviewing all of this information to inform its regional emergency response plan for the Georges River. And Liverpool Council, the New South Wales SES and the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment are reviewing the draft modelling outputs and assumptions before determining what will be used to assess the impacts of infill development and the major planning proposals that are planned for the area. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.